Mississippi, 1888. The town that vanished after the last inbred heir was born. This is not just a story, it's a dark fragment of American history that the state tried to erase. Deep in the humid swamps of Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, there existed a settlement that maps would later refuse to acknowledge. The town of Thornfield Ridge. Population in 1888, 47 souls. All sharing the same surname. All sharing the same blood. The story begins in the scorching summer of July 1888, when Dr. Edmund Pierce, a circuit physician traveling through the Mississippi Delta, received an urgent message. A woman in labor. Complications. The messenger. A thin boy of about 16 with unusually pale eyes and a severe underbite led Dr. Pierce down a muddy path that seemed to lead nowhere. What Dr. Pierce discovered that day would haunt him until his death in 1912. His personal journals, discovered in 1967 in a New Orleans estate sale, reveal the horror he witnessed. Thornfield Ridge wasn't on any official map. The settlement consisted of 11 wooden structures, all in various states of decay, circling a central well. The population moved strangely, some with pronounced limps, others with twisted spines that forced them to walk at odd angles. Dr. Pierce noted that nearly every resident had the same distinctive features: elongated skulls, eyes set too far apart, and hands with abnormally long fingers. The woman in labor was Sarah Mae Thornfield, age 19. Her husband, standing outside the birthing room, was her first cousin, Jacob Thornfield. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Jacob's mother and Sarah Mae's father were siblings. Both sets of their grandparents were the same people. Dr. Pierce realized with growing horror that he was looking at a family tree that didn't branch, it simply folded back onto itself, generation after generation, for over 70 years. The birth took 11 hours. The child, a boy they named Ezekiel, emerged into the world with severe deformities that Dr. Pierce carefully documented in his journal. The infant's skull had not properly fused. His legs were twisted inward at impossible angles. His eyes, milky white and unseeing, never opened. He lived for 3 hours. But Ezekiel Thornfield's brief existence had consequences no one could have predicted. Within 24 hours of the birth, Dr. Pierce noticed something disturbing. The residents of Thornfield Ridge were preparing to leave. All of them. When he asked the town's eldest member, a woman named Constance Thornfield, who appeared to be in her 60s but claimed to be only 38, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The line ends here," she said, her words slurred by a cleft palate that had never been corrected. "We knew it would. We all knew. Ezekiel was prophesied to be the last. The blood is too close now. Too thick. We've been dying for 20 years. And the children stopped surviving." Dr. Pierce learned that in the previous decades, 17 children had been born in Thornfield Ridge. Only 3 survived past infancy. Of those 3, 2 died before their 5th birthday. The last survivor, a girl named Mercy, had just turned 7, but she couldn't speak, couldn't walk, and spent her days staring at nothing, her body racked by seizures. The Thornfield family had originated in 1814 when brothers Caleb and Nathaniel Thornfield purchased 600 acres of swampland in what would become Tallahatchie County. They brought with them their wives, who were also their first cousins, in a determination to keep their land within the bloodline. For 74 years, the Thornfields married only Thornfields. When the population grew too small, they sought out distant Thornfield cousins from other counties. But even those unions were between people who shared great-grandparents, sometimes even grandparents. By the 1880s, the genetic consequences had become undeniable. Dr. Pierce's journal describes residents with jaw deformities so severe they could barely eat solid food. He documented cases of profound deafness, blindness, skeletal abnormalities that left people bedridden by their 20s, and mental impairments that ranged from mild to catastrophic. The most chilling entry in Dr. Pierce's journal, dated July 19, 1888, describes a family meeting he was allowed to observe. The remaining 47 Thornfields gathered in the largest structure, a meeting hall that smelled of mildew and decay. The eldest male, a man named Josiah Thornfield, age 53 but looking 80, stood before them. His speech was difficult to understand due to severe dental abnormalities, but Dr. Pierce transcribed what he could. "Our fathers' fathers kept the land pure, kept the blood pure. But God has judged us. The earth rejects our seed. Our children are born suffering. Ezekiel will be the last Thornfield born in Thornfield Ridge." What happened next sounds like fiction. but Dr. Pierce's account is corroborated by county records and newspaper clippings from the Tallahatchie County Gazette. Within 1 week of Ezekiel's death, every resident of Thornfield Ridge vanished. Not scattered, not relocated, vanished. Dr. Pierce returned to the settlement on July 28, 1888, just 9 days after Ezekiel's birth. The houses were empty. Personal belongings, clothes, furniture, tools remained in place as if the residents had simply evaporated. Confirase J.R. inscrito nest canal. Historias que historia official tenta apagar estawa que revelando verdades que nunca deveriam ter sido escuchadas. The local sheriff, William Cobb, launched an investigation. His report, filed on August 3, 1888 and preserved in the Mississippi State Archives, makes for disturbing reading. Sheriff Cobb discovered the Thornfield family cemetery on the northern edge of the property. It contained 137 graves. What made his blood run cold was the dates. Between 1878 and 1888, 92 people had been buried there. The population of Thornfield Ridge had been dying at an incomprehensible rate. Many of the graves were small. Children. Infants. The most recent grave was Ezekiel's, marked with a simple wooden cross, but there were 6 more fresh graves beside his, all dated July 21st through July 25th, 1888. 6 Thornfields had died in the days following Ezekiel's birth. The causes weren't recorded, but Dr. Pierce's journal offers a clue. He'd noted that several residents were wasting away, their bodies seeming to reject life itself. Sheriff Cobb followed a trail through the swamp, tracking what appeared to be the entire population moving south. The trail ended at the Pearl River, swollen from summer rains. There, on the muddy bank, he found 47 sets of footprints leading into the water, and none leading out. Dragging operations were conducted for 2 weeks. Not a single body was recovered. The Pearl River, known for its strong currents and hidden sinkholes, had seemingly swallowed the entire Thornfield bloodline. But the story doesn't end there. In September 1888, a land surveyor named Thomas Wickham was hired by the county to assess the Thornfield property for potential sale. What he found in the main house changed everything. Hidden in a locked room in Josiah Thornfield's residence, Wickham discovered a collection of documents that revealed the true horror of Thornfield Ridge. There were family records going back to 1814, meticulously maintained. Birth records, marriage records, death records. The marriage records told the darkest story. Of the 73 marriages recorded between 1814 and 1888, 68 were between first cousins. 3 were between second cousins who shared the same grandparents through different children. 2 were between uncle and niece. The birth records were even more disturbing. Between 1814 and 1850, the infant mortality rate in Thornfield Ridge was approximately 20% high, but not unusual for the era. Between 1850 and 1870, it climbed to 45%. Between 1870 and 1888, it reached 78%. But it was the death records that revealed the full scope of the tragedy. Wickham found detailed descriptions of the physical conditions afflicting the Thornfield descendants. By the 1880s, nearly every child born showed severe abnormalities, skeletal deformities, organ malformations, profound developmental delays, seizure disorders, and conditions that had no name in 1888 but that modern genetics would recognize as the result of extreme consanguinity. The documents also revealed something else the Thornfields knew. They documented their own decline with scientific precision. Josiah Thornfield had written in 1883, "We are watching ourselves disappear. Each generation smaller, weaker, more afflicted than the last. We have become our own extinction. To understand why the Thornfields married only within their bloodline, we must go back to the beginning. To 1814 in the swamps of Mississippi, when 2 brothers made a decision that would doom their descendants for 7 decades. Caleb and Nathaniel Thornfield were not poor men when they arrived in Mississippi territory. They came from Virginia, descendants of English settlers who'd accumulated modest wealth through tobacco farming. But in Virginia, they were small fish in a large pond, constantly overshadowed by the great plantation families. Mississippi represented opportunity, cheap land, no established aristocracy, a chance to build a dynasty. The brothers purchased 600 acres of fertile bottomland along the Pearl River for a fraction of what similar land would cost in Virginia. The catch? And the land was isolated, surrounded by miles of impenetrable swamp, accessible only by a single muddy road that became impassable during the rainy season. This isolation, initially seen as a temporary inconvenience, would become the foundation of the Thornfield tragedy. Caleb and Nathaniel brought their wives, Mary and Elizabeth, who were sisters and also their first cousins. This wasn't unusual for the time. Cousin marriage was legal and relatively common in early 19th century America, especially among families trying to preserve wealth and property. What happened next, however, went far beyond typical cousin marriage. The brothers established a covenant recorded in documents found by surveyor Wickham. The covenant had 3 rules. First, all Thornfield land must remain in Thornfield hands. Second, all Thornfield children must marry other Thornfields. Third, any Thornfield who married outside the family would be disinherited and banished. Why such extreme measures? The answer lies in the economic anxieties of the era. Caleb and Nathaniel had watched families in Virginia lose their land through poor marriages, unwise divisions of property, and the dilution of family wealth across generations. They were determined to build something that would last, a family empire that would grow stronger with each generation, not weaker. They couldn't have known they were creating a genetic prison. The first generation produced 12 children, 6 to Caleb and Mary, 6 to Nathaniel and Elizabeth. These 12 children, all first cousins, intermarried. 6 marriages, producing 31 children of the second generation. Already the genetic problems were beginning, though no one in 1840 understood genetics. Several of the second-generation children had what was described in family records as weakness of constitution. 3 died before reaching adulthood from unexplained ailments. 1 was described as simple-minded and never married. But the land was prospering. The Thornfields had built a successful cotton operation, and by 1850 they owned over 40 bonded workers who worked their fields. The family's wealth was growing, which only reinforced their belief that the covenant was working. The second generation produced the third, but here, the genetic problems accelerated. Of the 31 second-generation Thornfields, only 18 survived to marriageable age. These 18 married each other in various combinations, but the gene pool was catastrophically small. Many of these marriages were between people who shared not just grandparents, but multiple great-grandparents through different lines. The third generation showed the first undeniable signs of severe genetic consequences. A boy born in 1855 named Caleb III after his great-grandfather had what Dr. Pierce's later examination of family records identified as probable severe hemophilia. He died at age 12 from uncontrolled bleeding after a minor injury. A girl born in 1857 named Constance had severe spinal curvature that left her bedridden for most of her life. She lived to age 31, but was described in family records as twisted like an old tree. Twins born in 1859. Both had cleft palates so severe they could barely speak. One died at age 4 from inability to properly eat. The other survived to adulthood but never married. By the time of the Civil War, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Yet the Thornfields doubled down on their covenant. In 1863, with Union forces threatening Mississippi, the family held a meeting. The eldest members voted to strengthen the covenant, adding a provision that any Thornfield who even courted someone outside the family would be expelled. Why? Because they blamed their problems on those few family members who had shown weakness by expressing interest in outsiders. They believed the solution was purer bloodlines, not more diverse ones. The fourth generation, born between 1865 and 1880, was the beginning of the end. Of 43 children born in this period, only 19 survived past age 5. Of those 19, 7 had severe physical or mental impairments that made marriage impossible. The 12 healthy enough to marry fourth-generation Thornfields faced a terrible mathematical reality. Their gene pool consisted of 12 people, all of whom were related through multiple lines of descent. The genetic diversity that makes healthy reproduction possible had been utterly exhausted. They married anyway because the covenant demanded it, because family loyalty demanded it, because they literally knew no other life. Sarah May Thornfield, who would give birth to Ezekiel in 1888, was a fourth-generation Thornfield. Her family tree reads like a horror story of genetic collapse. Her 4 great-grandparents were actually only 2 people, Caleb II and his wife Rebecca, who appeared twice in Sarah May's lineage through 2 different children. Her coefficient of inbreeding, a measurement that modern genetics uses to calculate the probability of inheriting identical genes from both parents, would have been approximately 0.375. For comparison, a child of first cousins has a coefficient of 0.0625. Sarah May was more inbred than if her parents had been siblings. By 1888, the effects were everywhere in Thornfield Ridge. Dr. Pierce's journal describes what he saw during his brief time there in excruciating detail. He noted that the average height of adult males was approximately 5 feet 3 inches, with many significantly shorter due to skeletal abnormalities. Adult females averaged 5 feet even. For comparison, the average American male in 1880 was approximately 5 feet 7 inches. Nearly every resident over the age of 10 had severe dental problems. Missing teeth, malformed jaws, palates that hadn't properly formed. Dr. Pierce noted that soft foods and broths made up most of the Thornfield diet because many residents physically couldn't chew. Skeletal deformities were universal. Dr. Pierce estimated that fewer than 10 residents had what could be considered normal bone structure. Curved spines, twisted limbs, joints that bent at wrong angles, skulls that were elongated or compressed. The human form had become almost unrecognizable in some cases. Deafness and blindness were common. Of the 47 residents Dr. Pierce encountered, at least 12 had significant hearing impairment, and 7 were completely blind. Most of the blind had been born that way. Mental impairment ranged from mild to severe. Dr. Pierce estimated that perhaps 20 of the 47 residents could be considered cognitively normal, though even they showed signs of what we would now recognize as the effects of severe inbreeding depression reduced. Cognitive flexibility, memory problems, difficulty with complex tasks. Several residents suffered from what Dr. Pierce called falling sickness, seizure disorders that could strike without warning. He witnessed 3 separate seizures during his time in Thornfield Ridge. The most disturbing cases were the children. 7 children under the age of 12 still lived in Thornfield Ridge when Dr. Pierce arrived. Of those 7, not one could be considered healthy. The descriptions in his journal are heartbreaking. A 9-year-old boy who couldn't walk or speak, spending his days sitting in a chair, rocking endlessly. A 6-year-old girl with a skull so malformed her brain was visible beneath the skin. A 4-year-old who screamed constantly day and night from pain no one could identify or treat. The 7-year-old girl, Mercy Thornfield, represented the final stage of genetic collapse, born to parents who were themselves the product of multiple generations of cousin marriage. Mercy's DNA was so homogeneous that she was essentially the genetic equivalent of her own sibling. She couldn't walk, talk, or feed herself. She had seizures multiple times daily. Her eyes moved independently of each other, and she showed no sign of recognizing or responding to the people around her. To truly understand what happened in Thornfield Ridge, we need to understand the science of consanguinity, even though the residents of 1888, Mississippi had no such understanding themselves. Genetic diversity is the foundation of healthy reproduction. When 2 unrelated people have a child, that child receives a combination of genes from both parents. If one parent carries a harmful recessive gene, the child likely won't be affected because the other parent's healthy gene will dominate. But when close relatives reproduce, the probability of both parents carrying the same harmful recessive genes increases dramatically. The closer the relationship, the higher the probability. First cousins share approximately 12.5% of their DNA. When first cousins have children, there's an increased risk of genetic disorders. But if it's a one-time occurrence in an otherwise genetically diverse family, the risks, while elevated, aren't catastrophic. The Thornfields didn't engage in one-time cousin marriage. They engaged in systematic multi-generational consanguinity that collapsed their genetic diversity entirely. By the 4th generation, Thornfield's descendants weren't just marrying first cousins. They were marrying people who were related to them through multiple lines. In genetics, this is called pedigree collapse. Instead of having 8 great-grandparents, many 4th-generation Thornfields had only 2 or 3 unique ancestors in that generation. The same people appeared multiple times in their family tree. This created a genetic bottleneck of catastrophic proportions. Harmful recessive genes that would normally be diluted across a population became concentrated and expressed. The effects Dr. Pierce documented align perfectly with what modern genetics would predict from such extreme inbreeding. Skeletal abnormalities are common in consanguineous populations because bone development involves hundreds of genes. When genetic diversity is lost, these complex developmental processes go wrong. Cleft palates, malformed skulls, curved spines, and abnormal limb development all become more likely. Organ malformations follow similar patterns. Heart defects, kidney abnormalities, malformed digestive systems. The Thornfield death record suggests all were present, though 1888 medicine couldn't identify them specifically. Neurological problems are particularly severe because brain development is incredibly complex. involving thousands of genes working in precise coordination. When that coordination is disrupted by lack of genetic diversity, the results range from mild cognitive impairment to profound developmental disabilities. Immune system problems also plague inbred populations. The Thornfield death records show that infections that would normally be survivable often prove fatal. A simple respiratory infection could kill an adult Thornfield in days. Infant mortality, the most visible consequence, was devastating. Between 1870 and 1888, 78% of Thornfield infants died. Most never saw their first birthday. Many didn't survive their first week. Those who did survive often had such severe impairments that their quality of life was questionable. The children, Dr. Pierce described, lived in constant pain, unable to communicate, unable to interact with their world, unable to experience anything we would recognize as a normal childhood. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Thornfield story is that they saw what was happening. The family records make clear that by the 1870s, the Thornfields understood they were dying out. They documented their decline with heartbreaking precision, yet they continued the practice. Why? The answer lies in a toxic combination of isolation, religious conviction, and economic anxiety. The Thornfields were isolated not just physically, but psychologically. For generations, they'd been taught that outsiders were threats to family purity and land integrity. By the 1880s, most Thornfield Ridge residents had never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace. The outside world was alien, frightening, and to be avoided. Religious conviction played a role too. The Thornfields were deeply religious, and they'd developed a theological justification for their practices. They believed God had chosen their family for a special purpose, and that maintaining bloodline purity was a sacred duty. When things went wrong, they interpreted it not as evidence they should change course, but as a test of faith. Economic anxiety was perhaps the strongest factor. The Thornfield land represented everything: wealth, security, identity, legacy. The thought of dividing it or allowing outsiders to claim any part of it was unbearable. They would rather die as Thornfields than survive as something else. And die they did. By July 1888, the situation was terminal. Ezekiel's birth and rapid death represented the final proof that the Thornfield bloodline could no longer sustain itself. There would be no fifth generation. The residents of Thornfield Ridge faced a choice: scatter into a world they didn't understand and couldn't navigate, admitting that everything their ancestors had built was a failure, or end together as Thornfields. The evidence suggests they chose the latter. Now here's where I need you. If you've felt anything during this story: disgust, sorrow, anger, compassion, I want you to comment right now. Right. We must remember the forgotten. This story deserves to be remembered, and your comment tells me you're paying attention to these voices history tried to erase. Sheriff Cobb's investigation revealed something else that didn't make it into official reports but appeared in his private correspondence, discovered decades later. Several residents of nearby communities reported seeing a large group of people moving through the swamp toward the Pearl River on the night of July 26, 1888. One witness, a fisherman named Augustus Meade, claimed he saw them from a distance. He described them as moving in complete silence, in a single-file line, holding hands. He said there were adults and children, and that several of the adults were carrying those too infirm to walk. Meade said they walked into the Pearl River and kept walking. He said the current was strong that night from recent rains, and the water was high. He said he watched until the last of them disappeared beneath the surface. Meade never reported what he saw to authorities. He told his family years later on his deathbed in 1904, and his grandson recorded the account in a family Bible that eventually found its way to a historical society. Was Meade's account accurate? We'll never know. But it aligns with Sheriff Cobb's findings. 47 sets of footprints leading into the river, none leading out. No bodies ever recovered. The Pearl River, with its deep channels and fast currents, could certainly have carried bodies far downstream, possibly all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Or perhaps the bodies were caught in underwater sinkholes and submerged vegetation, trapped forever. But there's another possibility that some historians have considered. Perhaps the Thornfields didn't walk into the river to drown. Perhaps they crossed it, continuing south into the deepest part of the Mississippi swamp, seeking a place so remote that no one would ever find them. This theory is supported by occasional reports over the years. In 1903, a hunter claimed to have found a small settlement deep in the swamp, occupied by people who fled at his approach. In 1927, during the Great Mississippi Flood, rescue workers reported finding a group of people with severe physical deformities living on a small island, who refused assistance and disappeared into the floodwaters. As late as 1956, a geologist conducting surveys in remote parts of the Pearl River Basin reported encountering a family of extremely reclusive individuals with unusual physical characteristics who fled before he could make contact. Are these sightings connected to the Thornfields? Almost certainly not. They're more likely examples of other isolated consanguineous groups that existed in remote parts of the South. But they remind us that Thornfield Ridge wasn't unique. It was simply the most thoroughly documented example of a phenomenon that was probably more common than official records suggest. The most heartbreaking aspect of the Thornfield Ridge story isn't the adults who chose this life. It's the children who never had a choice. The final generation, those children born between 1880 and 1888, were born into a genetic catastrophe that guaranteed their suffering. They didn't choose consanguinity. They didn't choose isolation. They were victims of decisions made generations before they were born. Let's talk about some of these children, whose brief lives were documented in family records in Dr. Pierce's journal. Mercy Thornfield, born April 1881, was 7 years old when Dr. Pierce met her. In his journal he wrote, "The child called Mercy knows no mercy in this world. Her body is a prison from which there is no escape. She cannot speak, cannot walk, cannot even sit upright without support. Multiple times each day, violent seizures rack her small frame. Her eyes, clouded and wandering, see nothing. I do not believe she knows her own mother, who sits with her constantly, rocking her gently, singing hymns in a voice cracked with grief. What life is this? What purpose could such suffering serve?" Mercy's mother, Rebecca Thornfield, was herself the product of cousin marriage. Rebecca's parents were first cousins who shared the same grandmother through two different children. Rebecca had been born relatively healthy, a miracle in Thornfield Ridge by the 1860s, but she carried genetic damage that expressed itself catastrophically in Mercy. Rebecca stayed with Mercy constantly during the child's brief life. She fed her, cleaned her, held her through the seizures, whispered to her constantly, even though Mercy showed no sign of understanding. In the days after Ezekiel's birth, when the family decided to leave Thornfield Ridge, Rebecca was seen carrying Mercy down to the river. A boy named Nathaniel, born March 1883, lived only 16 months. Family records note that he was born with organs visible outside the body, almost certainly some form of severe abdominal wall defect. In an era before modern surgery, such conditions were death sentences. The fact that Nathaniel survived 16 months is remarkable. The fact that he suffered for 16 months is tragic. His father, Martin Thornfield, built a special cradle for Nathaniel that allowed the baby to rest without pressure on his malformed abdomen. Martin spent every night beside that cradle, watching his son struggle to breathe, unable to help, unable to fix what generations of Thornfield decisions had broken. Twin girls born in January 1885 named Hope and Faith were born premature and with severe developmental problems. Hope died after 3 days. Faith survived for 2 years but was described as never waking, suggesting she was in some form of persistent vegetative state. She died in May 1887, just 14 months before the family's disappearance. Their mother, Eleanor Thornfield, planted roses on their graves. Dr. Pierce saw those roses during his investigation of the family cemetery, 2 small graves covered in white blooms, lovingly maintained even as the family prepared to abandon everything. A boy named Joshua, born September 1886, appeared healthier than most Thornfield children, but by his first birthday it became clear something was severely wrong with his development. He never learned to crawl or walk. He never spoke. By his second birthday, he'd stopped growing entirely. Family records note that he died in March 1888, just months before Ezekiel's birth, fading like a flower deprived of sun. These children had names, had parents who loved them, had brief lives filled with suffering that no child should endure. And they were the lucky ones, the ones who survived long enough to be named and remembered. Between 1880 and 1888, 34 children were born in Thornfield Ridge. 26 died before their first birthday. Most died within days or weeks of birth. The unnamed children are buried in the Thornfield Cemetery in a section Dr. Pierce described as heartbreaking beyond words. Rows of tiny graves, many marked only with simple wooden crosses or rough stones. Some graves held multiple infant twins or triplets born together and buried together. The mothers of Thornfield Ridge bore these losses with stoic grief. In a community where infant death was the norm rather than the exception, they developed rituals to cope. When a baby was born with severe deformities, the women would gather. They would bathe the infant gently, dress it in white cloth, and sing hymns over it. They knew the baby would likely die within hours or days, and they wanted to ensure it was surrounded by love for whatever brief time it had. When an infant died, the women prepared the tiny body with care. Wrapping it in cloth they'd woven themselves, placing it in a small pine box the men built. The entire community would gather for the burial no matter how many times they'd done it before. Dr. Pierce attended one such burial during his time in Thornfield. Riga, baby born the day before Ezekiel, who lived only 6 hours. He wrote, "I have attended many funerals in my years of practice, but never one more sorrowful. These people bury their children with such practiced efficiency that it speaks to how often they must perform this terrible ritual. Yet there is nothing cold in their grief. Each loss is fresh, each tiny grave dug with trembling hands, each hymn sung with breaking voices. The question that haunts anyone studying Thornfield Ridge is, why did they keep having children? In some cases, they didn't have a choice. In 1880s rural Mississippi, birth control was virtually non-existent, and certainly unavailable to isolated communities like Thornfield Ridge. Women had children because women had children. It was the expected role, the purpose of marriage. But there was also a desperate hope driving them. Each new pregnancy carried the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this child would be healthy. Maybe this child would be the one to carry the Thornfield name forward. Maybe this child would justify all the suffering. It never happened. The genetic damage was too severe, too deeply embedded in every Thornfield's DNA. By the 1880s, there was no possibility of a healthy child being born. The question wasn't whether a child would have problems, but how severe those problems would be and how long the child would survive. Sarah Mae Thornfield knew this when she became pregnant with Ezekiel. She'd already lost one baby 2 years earlier, a daughter who lived 3 days. She knew the odds. Everyone in Thornfield Ridge knew the odds. But she carried the pregnancy to term anyway. Because what else could she do? Because hope, however irrational, is sometimes all that keeps people going. Because she was a Thornfield, and Thornfields didn't give up. When Ezekiel was born with deformity so severe that Dr. Pierce could barely look at him, Sarah Mae held her son for all 3 hours of his life. She whispered to him, sang to him, stroked his malformed face with gentle fingers. When he took his last breath, she kissed his forehead and said, according to Dr. Pierce's journal, "You are the last Thornfield born to suffering. It ends with you. No more. Please God, no more." 6 days later, Sarah Mae walked into the Pearl River with the rest of her family. She was 19 years old. In the end, Thornfield Ridge disappeared more completely than almost any American settlement ever has. Not destroyed by fire or flood, not abandoned gradually as residents moved to better opportunities, but erased, deliberately and mysteriously in a matter of days. The property itself remained, of course. 600 acres of Mississippi bottomland with 11 structures slowly decaying in the humid climate. But within a year of the Thornfield's disappearance, nature began reclaiming what humans had built. The fields went wild. Cotton plants, untended, were choked out by native vegetation. Within 5 years, the cleared land had returned to the swampy forest that had existed before the Thornfields arrived. The buildings collapsed one by one. The meeting hall fell in 1891, its roof caving in during a severe storm. The individual houses followed over the next decade, wood rotting in the constant moisture, foundations undermined by rising and falling water levels. By 1900, almost nothing remained of Thornfield Ridge except the cemetery, and even that was being swallowed by the swamp. Graves sank into the soft earth. Wooden markers rotted away. The careful organization the Thornfields had maintained was obliterated by nature's relentless advance. In 1903, Tallahatchie County sold the Thornfield land at auction. The buyer, a timber company, cleared what remained of the structures and harvested the valuable hardwood trees. Workers reported finding a spooky old graveyard that they left undisturbed, but they didn't record its exact location. By 1920, the cemetery itself had vanished. Swallowed by vegetation, its markers destroyed by time and weather, its exact location forgotten. Today, if you visit the area where Thornfield Ridge once stood, you'll find only swamp, thick, impenetrable, and silent. The land itself gives no hint that 47 people once lived there, worked there, married there, had children there, and ultimately died there. Local historians have tried several times to locate the exact site of Thornfield Ridge and its cemetery. All attempts have failed. The old road that led to the settlement washed away decades ago. The landmarks that might have identified the location are gone. Even satellite imagery is useless. The swamp canopy is too thick to reveal what lies beneath. The Thornfield family vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. But they did exist. We know because Dr. Edmund Pierce documented them. We know because Sheriff William Cobb investigated them. We know because county records, family papers, and scattered historical accounts prove they were real. 143 Thornfields were born between 1814 and 1888. 137 are buried in that lost cemetery. 6 others, the final 6 who died in the days after Ezekiel's birth, may also be there. Or they may have been buried hastily elsewhere, or their bodies may lie in the Pearl River. The final 47 Thornfields who walked into the river or deep into the swamp in July 1888 left no graves, no markers, no physical evidence of their final moments. They are remembered now only through documents scattered across archives, through journal entries yellowed with age, through occasional mentions in historical studies of consanguinity in isolated populations. The story of Thornfield Ridge forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, about the dangers of extreme endogamy, about what happens when families close themselves off completely from the outside world. It's a story that played out in various forms across America, in isolated mountain communities in Appalachia, in remote settlements in the Ozarks, in desert communities in the Southwest, in island populations along the Atlantic coast. Anywhere people isolated themselves completely and married only within extremely limited gene pools. Similar tragedies unfolded. The scientific understanding of why this happens is now crystal clear. Humans need genetic diversity to thrive. When that diversity is eliminated, genetic diseases emerge, physical abnormalities multiply, and eventually the population collapses. The Thornfields learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, through the suffering and death of their children. But the broader lesson is about the danger of ideological rigidity. The Thornfield Covenant seemed reasonable when it was first established. Keeping land within the family, building a dynasty, maintaining wealth across generations, these were normal goals for families in early 19th century America. But when those goals became more important than the well-being of family members, when maintaining the system became more important than questioning whether the system was working, when pride and tradition became more important than health and survival, catastrophe was inevitable. The Thornfields saw their children dying and chose to continue the same practices anyway. They saw physical deformities increasing with each generation and doubled down on bloodline purity. They had evidence that something was catastrophically wrong and responded by becoming more rigid, not less. This is the psychology of failed systems. When a deeply held belief is challenged by reality, some people respond by questioning the belief. Others respond by denying reality and clinging harder to the belief. The Thornfields chose the latter, and it destroyed them. In his final journal entry about Thornfield Ridge, dated August 15, 1888, Dr. Edmund Pierce wrote, "I've spent my career bringing life into this world. I've seen birth in all its forms, joyous, tragic, miraculous, and sorrowful. But I've never seen anything like what I witnessed in Thornfield Ridge. These were not ignorant people. They kept detailed records. They saw what was happening to them. Yet they could not break free of the covenant their ancestors had made. They were trapped by loyalty to the dead, unable to save the living. Perhaps their final choice to end together rather than scatter apart was the only freedom they had left. Perhaps walking into that river was the only way they knew to break a covenant they could neither keep nor abandon. I pray I never see such tragedy again." Pierce kept his word in one sense. He never returned to Tallahatchie County. But the memory of Thornfield Ridge haunted him. His later journal entries returned to it again and again, trying to make sense of what he witnessed, trying to understand how love and loyalty could become so twisted that they produced only suffering. He never found a satisfactory answer. Neither has anyone else who studied the Thornfields. What we're left with is a story, a dark fragment of American history, a reminder that isolation has costs, that genetic diversity matters, and that sometimes the traditions we think are preserving us are actually destroying us. The town of Thornfield Ridge vanished in July 1888 after the last inbred heir was born. The final 47 Thornfields walked into history and disappeared, leaving behind only graves, documents, and questions that have no good answers. But their story survives. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps we remember the Thornfields not to judge them, but to learn from them. To understand that when we close ourselves off completely, whether physically, genetically, or ideologically, we put ourselves on a path toward collapse. The swamp that now covers Thornfield Ridge is silent. The cemetery is lost. The people are gone. But the lesson remains. Some doors, once closed, should be opened before it's too late. If you've watched the story to the end, you understand why this channel exists. To remember the forgotten, to tell the stories history tried to erase, and to learn from tragedies that should never be repeated. Here's what I need from you. If you've made it this far, you need to subscribe. These stories require research, respect, and dedication to tell properly, and your subscription ensures more forgotten voices will be heard. Next, leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can know who truly values these stories and who's part of this community that refuses to let history bury its darkest lessons. Give this video a like if you believe these stories deserve to be told, and share it with someone who needs to understand that some chapters of history are too important to remain hidden. The Thornfields can't tell their story anymore. We have to do it for them.